For more than 2,000 years, the world has believed one thing about Cleopatra. She was irresistible. She was flawless. She was the most beautiful woman of the ancient world. Men went to war for her. Empires bent around her. Rome itself trembled in her presence. That's the story. But what if it was engineered? Because when modern scientists began re-examining the fragments Cleopatra left behind, her bloodline, her dynasty, the remains of those closest to her, something deeply unsettling started to emerge. The queen history promised may not have existed. What if Cleopatra wasn't a divine beauty? What if she was the product of one of the most genetically unstable royal families in history? What if her greatest battle wasn't against Caesar or Antony, but against her own DNA? For centuries, this question was impossible to answer. No confirmed tomb, no verified remains, no genetic proof. But today, archaeology and modern science are circling closer than ever. And the clues aren't romantic. They're disturbing. Because the deeper we dig into Cleopatra's world, the more it looks like she wasn't hiding from Rome. She was hiding from exposure. And it all begins beneath the earth. For years, historians insisted Cleopatra's body was lost forever, buried beneath modern Alexandria, destroyed by earthquakes, swallowed by rising seas, erased by time. Case closed. Searching for her tomb became almost embarrassing, the kind of fantasy archaeologists avoided publicly. Funding went elsewhere. Academia moved on, until someone refused to. Kathleen Martinez wasn't a career archaeologist chasing headlines. She was a criminal lawyer by training, and that difference changed everything. Because instead of asking where Cleopatra should be buried, she asked where Cleopatra would hide. Cleopatra wasn't naive. She knew what Rome did to defeated rulers. She had seen her own sister paraded in chains. She understood humiliation as a political weapon. If Cleopatra lost, Rome would display her body as proof that Egypt had fallen. So if she planned her own death, and history strongly suggests she did, why would she allow Rome to control the final image? She wouldn't. And that single idea shifted the search entirely. Instead of digging beneath Alexandria's obvious royal districts, Martinez turned west, 30 miles from the capital, to a neglected, crumbling temple called Taposiris Magna. At first glance, it made no sense. It wasn't a royal burial site. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't central to power, which is exactly why it mattered. Because if Cleopatra wanted to vanish, she wouldn't choose the obvious location. She would choose symbolism. Taposiris Magna was dedicated to Osiris, god of the afterlife. And Cleopatra didn't just see herself as a queen. She aligned herself with Isis. Osiris and Isis. Death and resurrection. Power beyond mortality. The temple wasn't random. It was ritual. For years, excavations revealed little. Broken statues. Coins bearing Cleopatra's image. Fragments of ceremonial objects. Interesting, but not revolutionary. Then the ground broke open. Beneath layers of limestone, archaeologists uncovered something impossible. A tunnel. Not a corridor. Not a drainage system. A massive, precision-cut tunnel carved straight through solid bedrock. Nearly 4,300 feet long. 6 feet tall. Running deep beneath the temple complex. Engineers studying it were stunned. The alignment was almost perfect. The geometry deliberate. The labor required enormous. This wasn't symbolic architecture. This was protection. You don't build a mile-long underground structure in unstable rock unless you are hiding something that must never be disturbed. And then came the second shock. Off the nearby coast, archaeologists discovered remains of a sunken harbor, evidence that this temple once connected directly to the sea. That changes everything, because now the temple wasn't isolated. It was strategic, accessible by water, hidden from the main city, protected underground. It had all the features of a controlled burial site. Not one built for display, one built for secrecy. And if Cleopatra orchestrated her own burial to avoid Roman humiliation, then this is exactly what it would look like. But the tunnel wasn't the most disturbing discovery. The Real warning came from the dead waiting above it, and what they were buried with. The tunnel was shocking, but what archaeologists found near it was worse. As excavations expanded around Taposiris Magna, researchers began opening nearby burial chambers carved into the rock. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Mummies. Standard wrappings. The slow decay of time. Then someone noticed the mouths. Inside several of the skulls, where tongues should have been, thin sheets of gold had been carefully inserted. Golden tongues. Not decoration. Not jewelry. Not status symbols. Ritual tools. In ancient Egyptian belief, the dead did not drift silently into the afterlife. They had to speak. They had to stand before Osiris and defend their lives. Words mattered. Speech meant survival. A golden tongue granted divine eloquence, the power to speak before a god. But here's the problem. This ritual was rare. Extremely rare. It wasn't given to ordinary citizens. It wasn't even common among wealthy elites. It was reserved for individuals connected to sacred authority. And at Taposiris Magna, it wasn't just one. There were many. 16 rock-cut tombs. Multiple mummies. Multiple golden tongues. That isn't coincidence. That's coordination, which raises a terrifying possibility. These people weren't buried randomly. They were positioned, prepared, waiting. Think about what that means. This temple wasn't functioning like a graveyard. It was functioning like a reception hall. If Cleopatra aligned herself with Isis, and Isis was divine partner to Osiris, then burial at a temple dedicated to Osiris wasn't symbolic. It was strategic theology. She wasn't planning to die as a queen. She was planning to ascend as a goddess. And those golden tongues? They weren't buried for the dead. They were buried to announce someone else. Someone far more important. Someone who hadn't arrived yet. This is where the discovery shifts from archaeology to something almost cinematic. Because if Cleopatra intended to be buried here, she wouldn't go alone. Royal burials in Egypt were rarely solitary. Pharaohs were often accompanied by loyal attendants, priests, and members of their inner circle. People who would serve them in the afterlife. But Cleopatra's situation was different. She ruled during the collapse of her dynasty. She had enemies everywhere. Trust was dangerous, which makes the presence of these burials even more unsettling. Because whoever these people were, they knew something. They knew the location. They knew the ritual. They knew what was coming. And they took that knowledge to the grave. If Cleopatra's tomb lies beneath that temple, hidden somewhere along that tunnel, then history may have misread her final act completely. She didn't simply choose death to avoid Roman capture. She orchestrated disappearance. A burial designed not to be found. A location protected by symbolism, secrecy, and loyal silence. Rome searched Alexandria. They never searched here. And maybe that wasn't an accident. But before we assume Cleopatra engineered the perfect vanishing, we have to understand something darker about her. Because Cleopatra wasn't just hiding from Rome. She was hiding from what her own bloodline had become. And to understand that, we have to talk about the sister she erased from history. Cleopatra's rise to power wasn't glamorous. It was ruthless. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not operate like a family. It operated like a survival contest. Loyalty shifted. Alliances collapsed. Blood meant nothing if power was at stake. And Cleopatra's greatest threat didn't come from Rome. It came from her own sister, Arsinoe. Young, intelligent, politically ambitious, and far more capable than history likes to admit. When Cleopatra was forced into exile early in her reign, Arsinoe didn't hesitate. She stepped into the vacuum and declared herself ruler. Not a placeholder, not a caretaker, a queen. And when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, Arsinoe didn't bow. She organized resistance. She commanded troops. At one point, she even helped trap Caesar inside the palace during the chaos of the Alexandrian War. For a moment, a real moment, Cleopatra had lost everything. That matters, because it proves something history often erases. Arsinoe wasn't a child playing politics. She was a legitimate rival. Eventually, Cleopatra maneuvered her way back into power, aligning with Caesar and crushing opposition. Arsinoe was captured, but she wasn't executed. Instead, she was dragged to Rome and paraded through the streets in chains, a spectacle meant to display Egypt's defeat. And something unexpected happened. The Roman crowd didn't celebrate. They pitied her. A teenage girl humiliated in public stirred sympathy. Even Rome had limits. That sympathy saved her life. Rather than execution, Arsinoe was exiled to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the most sacred sanctuaries in the ancient world. Holy ground. Untouchable. Or so she believed. Years passed. Cleopatra secured her throne. She built alliances. She ruled with calculated authority. But Arsinoe was still alive. And as long as she breathed, Cleopatra's claim to absolute power remained fragile. Because in unstable dynasties, symbols are dangerous. Arsinoe wasn't just a sister. She was an alternative, a rallying point for anyone who wanted Cleopatra removed. That couldn't be tolerated. So Cleopatra did something that shocked even ancient observers. She persuaded Mark Antony to violate sacred ground. Roman soldiers entered the temple of Artemis. They dragged Arsinoe down the temple steps and ended her life. It was a political execution disguised as necessity, and it sent a message. There would be no rivals left standing. But here's the part Cleopatra couldn't control. The location of Arsinoe's death was known, and that location would eventually become a doorway. Because centuries later, archaeologists uncovered a strange tomb in Ephesus, not far from where Arsinoe was executed. It wasn't ordinary. It was octagonal, architecturally unique, prestigious, the kind of tomb built for someone important. Inside was a skeleton. The age matched. The timeline matched. The place matched. For decades, scholars were confident. They had found Arsinoe, which meant they had found the closest biological link to Cleopatra ever discovered. Suddenly, Cleopatra's DNA felt within reach. Historians began reconstructing faces. Debates exploded over ancestry. The skeleton was treated like a genetic mirror of the queen herself. But there was a problem. The science wasn't finished. And when modern technology finally took a second look, the entire narrative collapsed. When researchers located the skull, stored quietly in university archives for decades, they used advanced imaging to map it in microscopic detail. Then they extracted DNA from the densest part of the bone. The results were undeniable. The skeleton was not female. It carried a Y chromosome. This wasn't Arsinoe. It was a boy, an adolescent between 11 and 14 years old. And the shock didn't stop there. The skull revealed severe asymmetry, developmental abnormalities, signs of chronic genetic disorder. Even more disturbing, the DNA didn't trace back to Egypt. It pointed toward southern Europe, which means for decades, historians believed they had Cleopatra's sister. Instead, they had something far stranger. A sickly foreign boy buried in a royal-style tomb, and no one could fully explain why. That mistake did more than embarrass scholars. It exposed something dangerous. If we were that wrong about the skeleton, what else have we misunderstood about Cleopatra's bloodline? Because the deformities seen in that boy weren't random. They were consistent with genetic collapse. And Cleopatra's dynasty was dangerously close to that edge. The boy in the tomb wasn't just a mistake. He was a warning, because the deformities written into his skull weren't accidental. They weren't the result of injury or malnutrition. They followed a pattern modern geneticists know too well. When bloodlines repeat themselves long enough, the body begins to pay the price. And Cleopatra's family tree didn't branch outward like most dynasties. It folded inward. Again, and again, and again. The Ptolemies weren't Egyptian by origin. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals who claimed Egypt after Alexander's death. They ruled a foreign land, and from the beginning, they feared losing control. Their solution was simple. Keep power inside the family. Not metaphorically. Literally. Brother married sister. Uncle married niece. Cousin married cousin. This wasn't occasional. It was policy. Marriage wasn't about alliances. It wasn't about diplomacy. It wasn't about love. It was about genetic isolation. They believed divine blood must remain pure. But biology doesn't care about royal belief. It responds to repetition. Modern science calls it pedigree collapse. In a normal family tree, each generation doubles the number of ancestors. 2 parents. For grandparents. 8 great-grandparents. But when close relatives reproduce repeatedly, the tree stops expanding. Ancestors start appearing more than once. The genetic pool shrinks. And eventually, flaws begin colliding with identical flaws. When that happens, recessive traits, normally harmless, become visible. And visible often means dangerous. By most estimates, Cleopatra's parents were likely full siblings. That alone places her in extreme genetic territory. But it didn't stop there. Her grandparents may have been uncle and niece. Her great-grandparents possibly siblings again. When researchers model that pattern, the results are alarming. Cleopatra's coefficient of inbreeding may have exceeded 40%. To understand how severe that is, consider this. The child of first cousins carries about 6%. The infamous Habsburg dynasty, known for producing rulers with extreme deformities and cognitive instability, peaked around 25%. Cleopatra's genetic burden may have been nearly double that. From a biological standpoint, survival alone becomes unlikely. Functioning at a high cognitive level becomes extraordinary. And yet, Cleopatra didn't just function. She dominated. She spoke multiple languages fluently. She negotiated with Rome's most dangerous men. She held Egypt together during collapse, which creates a paradox. If her bloodline was so compromised, how did she avoid becoming another casualty of royal inbreeding? The answer may not be that she escaped it. The answer may be that she managed it, because signs of genetic strain appear throughout her family history. Ancient descriptions of certain Ptolemaic rulers include obesity, so severe they could barely walk, swollen necks, bulging eyes, sudden mood shifts, weak limbs, short lifespans. At the time, these traits were dismissed as indulgence or gluttony. Now they resemble endocrine disorders, metabolic instability, thyroid dysfunction, the kind of conditions that pass silently through generations until they erupt. The boy in the octagon tomb fits that pattern. And if he was a byproduct of a collapsing bloodline, even indirectly, he represents what Cleopatra understood better than anyone. Her dynasty wasn't just politically unstable. It was biologically fragile. Growing up inside that court, Cleopatra would have seen it firsthand. Relatives who deteriorated early, bodies that failed unexpectedly, heirs who didn't survive long enough to rule. She would have known what her blood carried, and she would have known what Rome would do with that information. Because Rome didn't just conquer kingdoms. It dismantled legitimacy. If Cleopatra's body showed weakness, deformity, or visible genetic strain, Rome would weaponize it instantly. A flawed queen was easier to mock, easier to erase, easier to rewrite, which means Cleopatra's survival wasn't just political. It was biological. And that's what makes the mystery of her tomb so much heavier. Because if her remains are ever found, they won't just confirm her death. They will confirm whether she escaped the genetic curse or spent her entire life outrunning it. History praises Cleopatra for her energy. Relentless, magnetic, unstoppable. Ancient writers describe her as tireless, working late into the night, speaking rapidly, captivating everyone in the room. She negotiated with Rome's most powerful men without hesitation. She adapted quickly. She moved decisively. It reads like brilliance, but modern medicine might read it differently. Because extreme genetic pressure doesn't always look like weakness. Sometimes it looks like intensity. Thyroid disorders, particularly hyperthyroid conditions, can flood the body with hormones. The heart races. Sleep becomes scarce. Speech quickens. Thoughts accelerate. Confidence spikes. From the outside, it looks like charisma. From the inside, it feels like fire. Ancient descriptions of certain Ptolemaic rulers mention swollen necks and bulging eyes, classic symptoms associated with thyroid imbalance. Combined with sudden mood shifts and bursts of erratic behavior, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. If Cleopatra inherited even a fraction of that instability, then her legendary vitality may not have been effortless. It may have been biochemical, which reframes everything. What if her sleepless nights weren't ambition, but insomnia? What if her rapid speech wasn't seduction, but hormonal acceleration? What if her daring political risks weren't pure confidence, but a nervous system permanently pushed into overdrive? This doesn't diminish her intelligence. It complicates it, because managing that kind of condition without modern medicine would require constant awareness, constant adjustment, constant control. And Cleopatra had the tools to attempt it. Egypt in her era wasn't just spiritually advanced, it was medically sophisticated. Temple complexes doubled as research centers. Priests cataloged plants and compounds. Formulas were tested and refined over generations. Cleopatra had access to substances Rome barely understood. Opium for pain, herbal sedatives for sleep, incense blends designed to calm the mind, blue lotus preparations that softened anxiety and induced euphoria. These weren't indulgences. They were regulators. Used carefully, they could smooth out the edges of a body that ran too hot. And Cleopatra wasn't passive about these tools. Historical fragments suggest she studied cosmetics and chemistry in detail. She wasn't just wearing products, she was researching formulations. That matters, because cosmetics in the ancient world weren't just about beauty. They were camouflage. If thyroid imbalance caused eye prominence, kohl reshaped perception. If inflammation altered skin tone, mineral pigments corrected it. If metabolic issues caused swelling, jewelry and collars concealed it. Cleopatra didn't present herself as divine by accident. She engineered the image. She controlled lighting, scent, fabric, posture. Everything was intentional, because image wasn't vanity. It was armor. And this is where the story becomes truly unsettling. If Cleopatra was quietly regulating a volatile biology while ruling one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Mediterranean, then her reign wasn't effortless. It was a balancing act. Too much energy, and she risked collapse. Too little control, and symptoms would show. And Rome would notice. Rome did not tolerate weakness. It dissected it, mocked it, turned it into propaganda. If Cleopatra allowed even a hint of physical instability to surface publicly, her enemies would exploit it instantly. So she mastered herself. Or at least she tried. This makes her final disappearance even more deliberate. Because bodies eventually fail. Symptoms eventually surface. Time exposes everything. Cleopatra may have understood that her control had limits. And she refused to let Rome be the one to reveal them. Cleopatra understood something most rulers never fully grasp. Power isn't just held. It's performed. And performance, when perfected, becomes protection. By the time Cleopatra secured her throne, she knew her dynasty was fragile, politically unstable, genetically strained, surrounded by Rome's expanding shadow. So she did something radical. She stopped ruling as a queen. She started ruling as a goddess. Cleopatra didn't simply associate herself with Isis, as previous pharaohs had done symbolically. She embodied her. Public appearances weren't political meetings, they were rituals. Processions were choreographed. Clothing was layered with divine symbolism. Jewelry wasn't decoration, it was theology. She wasn't presenting a woman. She was presenting divinity. And divinity doesn't get examined the way rulers do. It doesn't get questioned for flaws. It doesn't get dissected. That wasn't arrogance. It was strategy. If Cleopatra suspected her body carried vulnerabilities, visible or invisible, then elevating herself above humanity neutralized scrutiny. Rome could challenge a monarch. Challenging a goddess was different. When she met Julius Caesar, she didn't approach him as a desperate ruler. She staged an entrance. When she met Mark Antony, she didn't negotiate from weakness. She appeared in spectacle, gold, incense, symbolism, rewriting the power dynamic before a word was spoken. These weren't seduction tactics. They were psychological warfare. Cleopatra understood that myth travels faster than evidence. If she controlled the myth, she controlled perception. And perception controls power. But myth alone wasn't enough. Because even goddesses die. And when they do, their bodies remain. Bodies reveal truth. Swollen joints. Bone thinning. Asymmetry. Stress fractures. The kind of markers modern science can detect centuries later. Cleopatra may not have known about DNA, but she understood exposure. She knew that once Rome possessed her body, they could reshape her story. If she looked fragile, they would say she was weak. If she showed signs of illness, they would call her unstable. If her skeleton revealed genetic strain, they would frame her as proof that Egypt was decaying. Rome didn't just conquer territory. It conquered narratives. And Cleopatra refused to surrender the final chapter. That brings us back to Taposiris Magna. If her burial was placed there intentionally, protected by symbolism, secrecy, and ritual, then it wasn't just about avoiding humiliation. It was about sealing the evidence. The underground tunnel wasn't a monument. It was insulation. The golden tongues buried nearby weren't random ritual. They were guardians of narrative. Cleopatra may have engineered a burial designed to preserve myth and prevent inspection. Not to be admired, to be inaccessible. Because Cleopatra's final act wasn't suicide. It was authorship. She wrote the ending herself. No Roman parade. No public autopsy. No physical proof handed to enemies. Just disappearance. And disappearance is powerful. As long as her body remains unfound, the myth survives untouched. The moment her remains are confirmed, the myth becomes measurable. And Cleopatra may have feared that measurement more than death itself. For centuries, Cleopatra has existed in a protected space. Untouchable, unmeasured, unconfirmed. No verified tomb. No confirmed remains. No genetic profile. Just story. And story is flexible. But bones are not. If archaeologists break through that final sealed chamber, if the tunnel beneath Taposiris Magna leads to a sarcophagus, if Cleopatra's remains are finally confirmed, the legend doesn't expand. It collapses into data. Her skeleton would be scanned, measured, modeled in 3 dimensions, bone density analyzed, microfractures identified, chemical residues tested, and the questions would be immediate. Was she physically robust? Was she petite? Did she suffer joint stress? Did she show signs of chronic inflammation? Are there markers of endocrine disorder? These aren't dramatic questions. They're clinical, and clinical truth is brutal. If Cleopatra carried the genetic burden her dynasty suggests, the signs will be there. Subtle thinning of bone, evidence of metabolic imbalance, possible asymmetry, markers of chronic physiological strain, not monstrous, not theatrical, but undeniable. And that changes everything, because for 2,000 years, Cleopatra's power has been partially rooted in image, beauty, seduction, physical magnetism. If science reveals a ruler who survived despite biological instability rather than because of physical perfection, the myth doesn't vanish. It transforms. And that transformation may be more unsettling than the legend, because it forces us to confront a different version of power. Not effortless dominance, but controlled chaos. A woman balancing political war with internal instability, negotiating with Rome while regulating her own body, projecting divinity while privately managing fragility. That version of Cleopatra isn't weaker. She's more formidable, but she's also more human, and humanity is what myth tries to erase. There's another layer to this. If residue analysis reveals compounds associated with pain relief or sedation inside burial goods, if traces of botanical alkaloids appear, that wouldn't suggest decadence. It would suggest management, a ruler chemically stabilizing herself to function under impossible pressure, which would make Cleopatra one of the earliest documented examples of sustained pharmacological self-regulation by a head of state. That isn't scandal. That's strategy. But Rome would never have allowed that narrative. Rome needed Cleopatra to be reduced, either a temptress who manipulated men, or a reckless ruler who brought ruin upon herself. Both narratives strip complexity. Both erase resilience. And both are easier than admitting she survived under conditions most rulers would have collapsed beneath. This is why her disappearance remains so powerful. As long as her tomb stays hidden, she remains undefined. The moment it opens, we will finally see what she fought against. And maybe, what she conquered. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra has survived as an image. A face painted onto coins. A legend rewritten by Rome. A beauty immortalized by Hollywood. But images are easy. Reality is harder. If her tomb is found tomorrow, if the scans begin, if her bones are finally studied with modern technology, we won't be uncovering a fantasy. We'll be uncovering a woman. A ruler born into a dynasty collapsing under its own genetics. A strategist navigating Rome while possibly managing chronic instability inside her own body. A queen who understood that myth could protect her where biology could not. And that changes everything. Because if Cleopatra wasn't physically flawless, if she wasn't the divine seductress history promised, then her reign becomes even more extraordinary. She didn't rule because she was perfect. She ruled because she adapted. She weaponized perception. She engineered divinity. She controlled narrative. And when defeat became inevitable, she denied her enemies the one thing they needed to dismantle her forever. Proof. No public remains. No measurable weakness. No final humiliation. Just silence. And silence is powerful. Maybe that's the real reason Cleopatra still fascinates us. Not because she was beautiful, but because she refused to be reduced. She may not have escaped her dynasty's genetic burden. She may not have escaped Rome, but she escaped exposure. And until that tomb is opened, she remains exactly what she intended to be, unfinished. If you want more stories where history's greatest legends collide with modern science, make sure you subscribe, because the deeper we dig, the less comfortable the truth becomes. And now I want to know what you think. If Cleopatra wasn't the flawless queen history promised, does that weaken her legend? Or does it make her the most formidable ruler the ancient world ever produced? Let me know below.